Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Circle of Life Coalition's monthly presentation. A couple of housekeeping points. We ask that everyone mute their microphones so that we can get the best quality speaking from our presenter. We also let you know that this is being recorded. It's being recorded as we speak. And if you do not want to have your face on, you just need to not have your video showing, okay? My goodness. We've been having some mild technical difficulties. What would it be a day without that here? So at the Circle of Life Coalition, we envision an informed community open to honest conversations about life and death, one in which we inspire each other to live life fully while acknowledging the inevitability of death, and where choices for end-of-life care are effectively communicated, documented, respected, and honored. Again, welcome. We do have a sponsor today. It is Griswold Home Care, and Gary will be doing a couple of minutes and letting him know what that fine organization does.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Hawkins, as Deb said. I'm going to keep it very brief. Everyone knows what non-medical home care is. If you're in our industry, or you're actually today with all the commercials that go on about it. But the difference, I think, with us, and I'll be brief again, is that here in our community in Berks County, we are the oldest. We started this back in 1989. 33 years ago, back when I remember going out and doing an intake and people said to me, "Are you like Mary Maids?" I knew I had a long road to hoe from that day forward, getting the concept of non-medical home care. Our parent company, we are a franchise, is celebrating 40 years this year, as Gene Griswold had started the company in 1982. The other point I just wanted to focus on is that while there is a caregiver crisis going on, a caregiver shortage, actually an employee shortage across the country, for us, I think one of the major things we have in our pocket, unfortunately, is that we haven't experienced that caregiver crisis, and we continue to expand and to add. In fact, we brought on 7 new people in the past 2 weeks, 7 new caregivers, qualified, trained, the whole 9 yards. So we are open and ready and available for service for your non-medical home care needs here in Berks County. Our number is 610-372-9940. Again, the name is Griswold Home Care of Berks County. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate that. I'm going to ask you to put your phone number in the chat. Speaking of chat, we will have time at the end of our presentation for some questions. What I'd like you to do is to please put any questions that you have in the chat section, and we'll ask them when Mr. Pellegrini asks for them. Okay. So who we have here today is Mr. Dennis Pellegrini. He has been in the financial industry since 1991. He graduated from Central Catholic as well as Alvernia University, where he earned a BA in Management and Administration and Bank Finance. He is a chartered financial consultant, an accredited estate planner, and completed his master's degree in financial services from the American College in 2007. Dennis has appeared on BCTV speaking on the topics of financial planning. He's dedicated to helping Reading area residents build wealth, keep wealth, and achieve their financial dreams. Dennis and his lovely wife, Peggy, live in Muhlenberg Township. In his spare time, Dennis loves to cook and play guitar. Thank you, Mr. Pellegrini. I'm going to put up your PowerPoint right now. Can everyone see that? Yes. Excellent. You just let
Yes.
me know when you needed it being advanced.
Okay, Deborah, thank you very much for those kind words. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And let me begin by telling everyone that, yes, I've been working as a financial advisor for over 30 years. I'm not here as a legal counselor, and I'm not here as a behavioralist. I'm here today to talk about something that affects us all, and there's a lot of interaction in our industries. And so there are some financial matters that you guys are aware of. There's some behavioral matters that I'm aware of. I'm here to just share a few items that I think are very important to share. And I'm also going to share a couple stories that I think will also shed some light on the topic. But the elder financial abuse issue is that it affects everyone, and there's a trickle-down effect. And so we have to be aware of what these trickle-down effects are and where it begins. So with that said, Deborah, would you like to go to the next screen? I will not read to you today, I promise. This is one of those screens where the definition is kind of important. And so let me just touch base on it briefly. Elder financial abuse can assume many forms. And when I say many forms, please understand there's a lot of things that stick out like violence, but there are a lot of things that are not violent that flow and go underneath the radar. But it can be broadly defined as fraudulent or otherwise illegal, unauthorized, or improper act or process of an individual, including a caregiver or fiduciary, that uses the resources of an older individual for benefit of their monetary or personal benefit, profit gain, results in depriving the elderly of their rightful use, and therefore benefits or lack of benefits for the resources belonging and the assets of the elderly person. So it's a textbook definition, a little dry, but nonetheless, it encompasses quite a bit. Deborah, go ahead to the next one. Okay. And so this is nothing new. It's a problem that's growing, unfortunately. But what you have to understand is that it does not discriminate. Kind of like a disease, it affects everybody, socially, financially, ethically, in educational matters, and it affects both men and women. So once again, it is important that everybody knows that this affects us all. And so we talk about the elderly being primary targets, and for the most part, I think we can all agree that one of the reasons is that they have diminished capacity, both physically as well as mentally. So that's why they become targets. But there's also something that's very important here, and that is that they're less likely to report fraud by a family member or caregiver due to the fact that there's fear of abandonment. It may cause problems within the family, and there may be some disabilities and other issues in which they're relying on these individuals for help. The isolation issue is nothing new. It's both physical, it's social. There's loneliness, there's depression that comes into play. It's not uncommon for it to be amplified in the event that a loved one dies. And, cognitive impairment, whether it be physical or mental, it does take place. And of course, there's the issue with substance and alcohol. Now, what you have to understand here is that some of these issues have been around for a long time. The elderly may have been suffering from depression years and years and years ago. And so you have to be careful not to just assume that, okay, this is because they're old. The family conflicts may have been there forever. I believe it was Jack Canfield who wrote the book Chicken Soup for the Soul, who said that about 85% of the population of families are dysfunctional. So to have family conflict would be nothing new. But now earlier I mentioned that this issue affects men and women. There is a slight issue there to take into consideration that because women live longer, they may be affected a little bit more than men. Now, once again, I'm not going to read to you, but I just want to point out that some of the warning signs may be things that, as I mentioned a moment ago, have been going on for years, decades. For instance, decline in checkbook management. There are people in their 30s and 40s and 50s that don't do well with managing their checkbook. So this is nothing necessarily new for an elderly person, but it is a sign. The memory lapse is obvious, as people start to age and that the diminished capacity takes place, you will see that they're forgetting things. But that happens to people who are also stressed. So may not necessarily be just an elderly person who's getting old and losing their faculties. So there could be other things going on. And that's where the doctors and the medical people come into play, which I'm not, and most of us aren't. But nonetheless, you have to be careful that you don't jump to conclusions and say, well, the memory lapse, they're dealing with Alzheimer's or whatever. It may just be that they're stressed out about something. So once again, there's all kinds of different impairments. Let me just go over one more before we go to the next screen. If they're having a difficult time paying the bill after lunch or dinner, or if they're having a difficult time figuring out what the tip is, that might be a warning sign. But once again, please understand, if mom or dad or grandma or grandpa at one time had absolutely no problems with that before, but now all of a sudden they are, that's a pretty good warning sign. Once again, I'm not going to read to you. I just want to touch base on a couple things here. If you look at the issue of desperation in number one, you'll see that the exploiter may have an addiction, drug, or alcohol problem. And so I've had this conversation with colleagues before where we've all agreed that these drug and alcohol addictions, these other addictions like gambling, there's a trickle-down effect and it affects us all. So we can't just look at it and say, well, that's a shame. God bless that family or God bless that person, but it doesn't affect me, when in fact is sooner or later it will. And so you have to be careful. Moving down to the section on romantic relationships. We've all seen movies. Hollywood has done a great job of amplifying that, where, you have the Black Widow. There's movies that really amplify this, but let me give you a real quick story. There was a gentleman, probably, this is going back 25 or so years ago, when I was relatively new in the business, sold his business and had a very large sum of money that he needed to reinvest. He had recently been widowed and he had a new girlfriend, and I had proposed some ideas to him, which she put the kiboshes to. And eventually what he ended up doing is investing those proceeds in a startup business for one of her children. And so they looked at what I was offering as though something, out in left field, and it was too risky, but yet they turned around and reinvested it in something that was extremely risky. But she had control of the situation, and there was a romantic relationship there, and there was nothing that I was going to be able to do. Logic was not going to override anything that was going on. There was another situation where I had a couple. Now, this is a younger couple. They were probably in their 50s, early 60s. And it was a second relationship. She had been married and divorced, and she had funds that she needed to reinvest. And her boyfriend, I don't know if he was, they were engaged to be married, but he came along to the meeting, and there he was, leaning back in the chair with his hands behind his head, talking over her and calling the shots. And I was very uncomfortable with it. I wasn't sure whether or not they would be healthy to take them on as clients. The fact of the matter is they made the decision to go someplace else, which was probably good for everybody. But it was very uncomfortable. He was dominating the conversation, and it wasn't even his money. So a lot of times there's romantic relationships that get involved, and they can really cause the water to get really muddy. We all know about the fact that some of these elderly individuals are coerced or flat out tricked. I'll give you a quick story about the trickery. A client of mine, elderly woman, lived in her house, probably should not have been there. She had Parkinson's and some arthritis issues and was moving very, very, very slowly. A man comes to the door. Now, this is somewhere in the ballpark of September, October, so it's not too cold, it's not too warm. The door was open. The screen door, I believe, was unlocked. Doorbell rings. She goes to the door. This man presents himself as an employee of the utility company. And he opens up the screen door and says, I need to come in and go down to your basement to look at your electric box to make sure everything is good. And, she was a little concerned, but didn't really have a whole lot of choice in the say in the matter because he had opened up the door and allowed himself in. So they go down to the basement and they're playing around with light switches. And meantime, someone goes in the house, goes upstairs to the bedroom, knows where the jewelry box is, and takes a couple pieces of jewelry. Next thing you know, the elderly woman does not see the man. She doesn't even know that he left. She goes upstairs, a little suspicious, calls the utility company, only to find out that there was nobody there on behalf of the utility company. Immediately became suspicious and for some odd reason went right to her bedroom and looked at her jewelry box and found 3 pieces missing. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I personally feel as though that's an inside job because why wouldn't they just take all the jewelry? But nonetheless, there was definitely trickery involved there. And lo and behold, probably turned out to be not too bad. There was nobody injured. And the amount of theft was somewhat limited, but there was definitely trickery involved. Next screen, please. Okay. So who does this? The person closest to us, the most trusted people in our lives. And that's what makes this so sad. The perpetrators are not limited to relatives, caretakers, but it could be a neighbor, a friend, could be lawyer, could be a tax advisor, could be an insurance professional, could be their financial advisor. It's somebody that's close to them. We all know that the easy way to manipulate or steal from the elderly is to just go into their purse or their wallets, but it's not uncommon to steal property. I'll give you an example. There was an individual who took a antique, I think it was a lamp, and one of the siblings questioned her about it, and she got all defensive and said, what's the big deal? I'm going to inherit this someday anyway, so we might as well have it now. And so there was that sense of entitlement. But we talked about stealing valuables. In the previous story, I believe in my heart that it had some sentimental value, and so it was stolen for sentimental value versus other reasons. Sometimes what you'll find is that property is stolen, like jewelry, taken to a pawn shop, cash is then received, and drugs, alcohol, gambling debts. You just never know what the money is actually going to be used for, but things are stolen a lot of times for those reasons. And so there's always deceit involved, sometimes intimidation. Mom, if you don't do, or dad, if you don't do what I tell you to do, you can find somebody else to take care of you. That kind of stuff goes on. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not violent for the most part, and therefore it flies underneath the radar. They get away with it. So we all have to be very careful to keep our eyes and ears open. Other methods of scheming or denying elderly. One could be medical. And you might think, well, how can that be the case? Well, let's say there's some eye surgery that needs to take place and it's not covered by their insurances. Well, that might be a couple $1,000s out of pocket. Well, the caregiver, whether it be a family member, a friend, a neighbor, they might be thinking, well, no, you could just go without it. Just get another pair of glasses or something like that. It may seem somewhat harmless, but it actually is abusive. Denying them of medical care is definitely a nonviolent way of abusing them, but it is nonetheless abuse. Isolation, I'll touch on that. As I mentioned before, the isolation could be physical, it could be social, but the bottom line is that they need to be involved with their friends and family. And so why isolate them? Well, if the caregiver is up to no good, If isolating them prevents them from being around other people, they can't talk about it with other people. So the scam continues on. So isolation is usually a method in which they incorporate. Also, creating a joint bank account. I'm against this, and I'll tell you why. Um, if there's a need for the caregiver to have access to funds, there's a thing called the power of attorney. Once again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a behavioralist, and but there's a lot of interaction and crossing in fields. Power of attorney is the way to go. Having a joint bank account allows the individual access to money, but not only that, they may be able to get other assets that are not in their name transferred over into a bank account or account that has both their names. And then when mom or dad dies, that money goes to the joint survivor. Well, that may not be what mom and dad originally intended for. So it's an easy way to manipulate and scam from the rest of the family. Forging checks, signatures, these are pretty obvious types of crimes. Transferring the deed, the title, once again, these are very obvious. But let's talk about transferring the title of a car. Gary, I think you talked about a story in the BCT TV program where a caregiver eventually developed a very close relationship with the elderly person and managed to get them to transfer over the title of the car. Now, the scam sometimes goes like this. They'll tell the individual, look, I have to take you to the doctors. I have to drive you to the grocery store and run errands for you. It's probably best that, I be on the title of the car so that, in case there's an accident, I'm not in trouble. So there's all kinds of ways to manipulate and scam. Transferring the title or deed is definitely not something that anybody wants to do or should do. So be careful of that. Now, I mentioned the idea of having a power of attorney. If you have power of attorney in the wrong hands, obviously that's going to be a problem. I personally believe that one of the ways in which we deal with this issue is to have multiple people involved, but you have to have the right people. And so there's a check and balance in place. And so having a power of attorney, but having people looking over what's going on is also very important. Once again, you could end up giving somebody, the wrong person, power of attorney. So having a check and balance system is definitely something worth considering. Changing life insurance, wills, trusts, and other legal documents. Guys, we could probably do an hour or so just on this topic alone. And you may have already had estate planning lawyers on your program talking about these issues, but let's talk about insurance policies, life insurance. Often I hear people say, well, I have a will and, Betty, my daughter, gets everything, or Betty and my son, or whatever. But there's a life insurance, or there's an IRA, or there's an annuity, and they have beneficiary designations. And so that does not go according to the will. IRA accounts have beneficiary designation, 401k accounts, 403b accounts, they have beneficiary designations. And so it's not uncommon for someone to get divorced and not change the beneficiary designation on one of those types of accounts. I'll give you another scenario where perhaps you have Jane and John Doe. Jane dies, John has a policy. John wants his daughter to receive the funds, but he thinks because he has a will, everything's taken care of. But on the life insurance policy, he'll have his wife as primary beneficiary and the two kids as contingent beneficiaries. Well, he probably forgot to change that beneficiary designation when he updated the will. Here's the problem. Betty may or may not get the full amount. Probably not, because the son is still alive, and maybe the son is not in a good way. He might be incarcerated, may have drug or alcohol or gambling problems. And so half the money is going to go to the son and half the money is going to go to the daughter. But meantime, the father thinks that everything's going to go according to the will. Once again, if there's a beneficiary designation, chances are that is not the case. So that's also one of the ways in which people get scammed. The perpetrators are clever. They're clever. And so they've been coached sometimes, and they just happen to know better than the elderly. And that's one of the ways in which the elderly gets tricked. So there's this term called domestic financial abuse, but basically it's someone that develops a relationship over time. It's not a single incident. It happens over time, and it usually happens more than once. If you go to the next screen, I think there's an example of what we're referring to. So here you have a home health aide who is providing service to an elderly individual, and he or she is getting a $75 check for doing laundry, but they're not supposed to be. And what happens is some way, shape, or form, that person was taken off the job. Another caregiver stepped in. They're doing the laundry. The elderly person gives them the $75 check, and they're like, oh no, this is part of what I'm supposed to be doing. And then the scam is the scam is now exposed. This ended up costing this caregiver a couple thousands of dollars over a 2-year period. So this was an actual case example. And so once again, you have to be careful because they're clever and it's not a violent thing. So once again, has a tendency to fly underneath the radar. Telemarketing scams. I strongly suggest that you have these elderly individuals placed on a do not call registry. It may take a month or so before it goes into effect. And it used to be like a 5-year period. Now it's much longer. There's a good reason for this. The telemarketers know how to scam these seniors, especially when there's diminished capacity. If we go to the next screen, I think there's a little bit more information on this. And so, yeah, there you go. Charities. You have individuals call the seniors and tell them that they're from some type of charity and that, they would like to have you solicit some funds for them. And so the scam goes on and on. One of the issues is natural disasters. So they may get a phone call from someone that says, I represent the Red Cross, and you've seen that there was these tornadoes in the central part of the country. Would you, can you help us out? And they get their credit card number, or maybe they get their routing number and their account number on their check. And at that point in time, bad things are going to happen. Lottery scams. They'll do enough homework to know that the individual might be a veteran or a member of some other group. And they'll congratulate them and tell them that they were automatically enrolled because they're a veteran and they won. And they'll go on and cheer them on and say how great it is that they won this lottery. To claim your prize, we just need a little bit of information from you. And, they start asking things like the date of birth and their name and where they live. And by the way, there's a small fee that we need to mail or overnight you the information so that you can fill out the form to claim your prize. They get their account number, they get their, bank account number. And once again, only bad things are going to happen at that point. How are we doing on time, folks? Okay, I can't hear you at this juncture.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. So I was a Boy Scout, and one of the things that they taught us is to plan ahead, to be prepared, be prepared. And so number one issue is to plan ahead. And if you look a little further on number one, it says to be specific and detailed. Have trustworthy people, as I mentioned, 2, maybe more, to act as an agent on their behalf. Have copies of everything. Recently heard a story where an individual was disinherited because they couldn't find a copy of the will. It was hidden. There's all kinds of things that can happen. And, there are individuals out there that will say, well, we'll hire somebody, hire a lawyer, we'll go after them and file a police report. And that's fine and dandy, but the money, once it's stolen, it probably only takes a couple hours before it gets used. And it's just really difficult to get it back. At the bottom there, it says include instructions to have an attorney or financial advisor. I have an updated version of this PowerPoint, and in that I put an attorney and financial advisor, because once again, you want as many professionals working together, the right people, tax person, legal person, financial advisor, all working together to make sure that the shenanigans are at a minimum, if at all. So include the right people, have more than one person involved. I think that's one of the things that you want to educate people on. and make sure that they have a plan and that it's specific and extremely detailed. One of the things that I tell people all the time, especially if there was a death involved, don't make any decisions right away. Take your time. And when it happens where someone does pass, some people want to take care of matters right away. Some people, they'll put it off and they'll put it off. It depends on that individual, but it's usually a good idea not to rush into any big decisions. If it's a caretaker working for a company, they're already most likely going to have a background check. In my industry, we have fingerprinting and background checks, so it's not uncommon. And be cautious. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And don't be afraid to say no. Sometimes no doesn't mean no, it just means not now. So do your due diligence. If it doesn't feel right, do your due diligence and look things through thoroughly before you make any decisions. Once again, being a Boy Scout, be prepared. Okay, so social awareness, loved ones, the rest of us. They say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that same village needs to be diligent in looking over our elderly. And so the signs may be behavioral, may be transactional, but we as loved ones need to follow it and look over things. And once again, it's always good to have more than one person involved, that there's a check and balance system involved. We'll talk about this a little bit further, but the red signs are usually behavioral. Unusual financial transactions are usually a red flag. Large and frequent and large withdrawals are a red flag. Making gifts to the caregiver, that's a large flag. Typically, that's not something that they had been doing in the past, but now all of a sudden, that's something that they're doing. You need to possibly look into that. Along with that, if there's a meeting and all of a sudden, and I told the story earlier, maybe I didn't, there was a client of mine, she came in to visit, she brought her boyfriend, her new boyfriend, and he was asking questions, and I thought it was a little bit inappropriate. I was a little concerned, but I didn't do anything about it. Eventually what I found out is she broke up with him, so the problem was solved. But if you start having new people involved in meetings, that could be a red flag. If there is a meeting and you see that the elderly person is nervous, maybe there is something going on. Maybe there are some unusual financial transactions going on. And as their financial advisor, they're probably figuring that you're going to figure it out. And maybe they're scared because maybe they don't want to turn in the person that's doing it. And I mentioned it earlier, isolation, blocking friends or family from communicating, because once again, if the elderly person is cut off from the rest of the world, they can't really fill anybody in on what's going on. Or if they are around friends and family, but the caregiver doesn't allow them to do it without the presence of the caregiver, that might be a red flag. Credit card debt that normally was not there, that's a red flag. Large sums of money that are needed all of a sudden. Why? That's a red flag. So there's a lot of different red flags here. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to read to you, but the issue here is behavior has changed. There's something that has changed, and the behavior all of a sudden has changed. That's the biggest red flag. I will say this, that financial transactions that are typically not in their profile will also be a red flag. I'll give you an example. Let's say you got a son or a grandson who thinks that he's Mr. Wall Street and does day trading, and all of a sudden grandma and grandpa has money that's going into Bitcoin. Well, Bitcoin has made a lot of millionaires, but that doesn't mean that it is something that grandma, grandpa, or aunt, uncle should be invested in. So that's the type of financial transaction. It's definitely outside of what seniors typically would be doing. So the other thing is that they may cash things in with penalties. They may cash things in that have tax implications without any consideration. That's usually a red flag as well. Checks written to cash, red flag. Don't do it. Don't let them do it. If that's being done, change that situation so it can't be done anymore. New enthusiasm over a new financial opportunity. A lot of times seniors will get things in the mail and they think it's a great opportunity. They fill it out, they send it in nice with, a check or credit card information. That's also a red flag. That's typically something you got to be careful of. And, once again, all of a sudden you have a family member who shows up that wasn't around before. Now that they want to be in their life, that's a red flag. A lot of these are pretty obvious, and I'm probably telling you people things that you already know, but nonetheless, these are your red flags. Giving somebody power of attorney that does not or should not be the choice. We've talked about it before. Have more than one person involved, more than one person. There's a checks and balance system. Some people may say, well, that's going to cause discord and problems among the people who are trying to take care of mom or dad. But if you get the right people, the financial abuse is going to be to a minimum. And so once again, don't put people in the accounts. Power of attorney is more of an appropriate way of doing it. And having a check and balance system is another important factor. Excuse me. All right, so there are some professions in which mandatory reporting is involved, and you'll see that that's in the healthcare, the clergy, accountants, lawyers, and social workers. And so there's a duty if you suspect that there's financial abuse to report it. And there's a state a state adult protective service agency that you can call. If you were to Google that, APS or Adult Protective Service Agency, you'll get a page that comes up. It's from the state. And then there's an icon that looks like a phone. You click on that, and that's how you go about reporting it. But there are some industries in which reporting is mandatory. So you may already know that because you're in one of them. Now, there's some privacy issues. One of the most prevalent laws that are on the books is the Graham-Leach Bliley Act. But then there's also state laws. And so once again, as I mentioned to you folks before, I'm not a lawyer. There's some state laws, there's some federal laws, there's some privacy issues. We've all heard the fact that there's protection for whistleblowers. The fact of the matter is, if you're not sure, talk about it with your superior, most likely your compliance department, and go from there. In our industry, if you're a financial advisor, you're probably familiar with the NASAA, and makes very clear that advisors and state regulators, they have to determine that there's a qualified individual and have reasonable belief that the exploitation is taking place. Now, reasonable belief, some of you may have heard me say this before. If you see something, if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, you're probably right. But do your due diligence. Don't overreact. Make sure that your reasonable belief has some merit. Taking this a little further, the reasonable belief that the elder is being financially exploited, once again, report it. However, disclosures may not be made to a third party. So you got to be careful about who you say this to and who you don't say it to. Obviously, you don't want to confront the perpetrator because you might be, sounding off the alarm. But once again, don't overreact. Document things, report it to the appropriate people. We'll talk a little bit more about who to report it to, but starting off with your supervisor and your compliance department at the company that you work for. There's also FINRA rule, and once again, these past couple slides, they're for financial professionals, but defining adult could be a person that's age 65 or older. It could be an 18-year-old or older who has some medical or physical impairments. Bottom line is that you need to know what you're dealing with. Take your time, do your due diligence, report it to the appropriate people. We talked about this on the BCTV program, the Senior Safe Act. encourages financial institutions to train their employees. So you may be one of those individuals that's not working for a company that can provide this training. And so I understand and appreciate your trepidation. But the good news is that there are laws in place to help protect the whistleblowers, and there is training involved to help identify and report such abuse. And so you may not be a financial professional, you may not work for a company that has this type of training, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll get to that in another screen or two. And there it is. Duty to remain diligent. If you don't work for one of these companies that has a compliance department or a supervisor that you can go to, there's the Berks County Area of Aging. Contact them. I believe in the BCTV program, Gary mentioned that contacting the police is not your first direction. They'll probably direct you to an organization like the Berks County Area of Aging, because they need to file a report, and there's a protocol there. And so if you don't have a compliance department, contact the Berks County Area of Aging. Let me summarize by saying the red flag is change in behavior. And that's with any age. It could be your children, it could be your coworkers. It's not just seniors, but if you see a change in behavior, that is your number one red flag. Look into things, don't overreact, document things, report it to the proper people, and go from there. Questions? Hopefully I didn't go too fast. I know there's a lot of information.
Mr. Pellegrini, I have a question. When you indicated to call the Berks County Area on Aging, when someone is under a certain age, I'm not sure that that's who you would call. If it's somebody between 18 and, I don't know, 55, is there a different mechanism, or you still call them?
Well, as the one screen pointed out, if there's some mental health issues, there's probably other organizations like Service Access Management. And so there's always the possibility of contacting a lawyer and having the lawyer give you direction. But if the person is under the age of 65 and they don't have any mental health issues, start with Service Access Management and go from there.
Okay, thank you.
And by the way, unfortunately, I have had to contact them. I've had, unfortunately, a business associate who I personally feel has some mental health issues. They probably have been undiagnosed, and therefore, once again, that behavior, somewhat violent, leaving me messages where, he's threatened to commit suicide and it's my fault. That's what I did. I contacted Service Access Management and they took care of it for me.
Okay. While I was screen sharing, I wasn't able to look at questions. If anybody, Tom or Gary, there were questions that came up.
No, there weren't.
Okay. If you notice, now I know we're talking about elder abuse, but if you notice someone who's younger than 18 that has an issue, you would maybe start with the financial institution, or?
That's a good question, Deborah. And, as I mentioned to you before, I'm not a behavioralist, so it's not my area of expertise. My thought process right away would be start with Service Access Management, maybe reach out to a lawyer. And I'm sure that there's various agencies out there that protect children, just like we've talked about in protecting seniors. Bottom line is to be an advocate. Don't turn your head. It's just, whether you're legally bound or not, the moral issue is to look into it. And I'm not saying that you have to jump in the middle of a fight, but call somebody, take action. Don't allow that person to continue to be victimized.
Okay. Thank you. There will be a poll that comes up for those who have joined us today to give your opinion. You can also go to circleoflifecoalition.org and enter some comments there. This recording will be available on Facebook in the next few days. The BCTV program is on our YouTube channel, or go to bctv.org. The YouTube channel, you just put in Circle of Life Coalition YouTube. After Mufasa, we're there for the recordings that are on BCTV. Very informative. I really appreciate the fact that you presented this, and most definitely important information.
Deborah, one last closing thought I'd like to share with the group. Keep in mind, I touched on this briefly, but it's very important for the folks to understand that a lot of these seniors do not want you to blow the whistle. Now, as I mentioned, some of you are in an industry where you have to report it. And for some of us, we're in industries that require it, but it's not mandatory. I think it should be mandatory. But don't forget the fact that these seniors really don't want you to blow the whistle, because they don't want what'll come down the road. Perhaps that person that was stealing the jewelry was, a caregiver or a child or somebody that would end up getting incarcerated, and they don't want that. They rather just deal with the problem and let it go, as opposed to solving the problem and putting an end to the abuse. So be careful about being a whistleblower. Me personally, I think it's probably better to be anonymous. That's your choice. It's a personal choice.
Right, I agree. It's scary. I've been a power of attorney for my mother and my uncle, and I was always so worried somebody was going to come audit. But that's not who we're talking about. We're talking about people who really don't care that they're going to be audited for the check that you helped, your mother or your uncle write, and so forth. So, yeah, I agree with consulting with attorneys. They are other financial planners. They really help a lot. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Please answer the poll. In March, our discussion will be with death doulas, who will tell us what that means to be present with someone during the end of their life and the positivity that can come from it. So please join us in March for that. A flyer will be forthcoming soon, and our link, of course. If you wish to donate to our cause, please go to circleoflifecoalition.org and hit the donate button. Also, there are many of us who would be willing to chat with anyone who has questions about any of our programs or quality of life and end of life issues. So you can put those questions through the circleoflifecoalition.org. And if it's a question to any of our presenters, if we have not provided their email address or their phone number, we can filter questions to them and get answers to you. I want to thank everybody for their time. I think we're going to give you about 12 minutes back today. And again, thank you for coming, and thank you, Mr. Pellegrini, for a very wonderful presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.